The astonishing speed with which we have adopted digital technology for virtual work has created an opportunity to reset work that, at best, can help make our work lives more purposeful, productive, agile, and flexible. This event aims to shed light on the complex considerations that company leaders and HR executives are facing as they move forward in a new normal after the pandemic. As leaders attempt to balance a work from home or hybrid working model, there are many considerations to pay attention to. During today's program, we'll hear varying perspectives on these considerations to hopefully guide you as you develop your strategies in your own organizations. Today, we'll hear from Anne-Marie Abrahamson, employment law expert and partner at Lundgren's law firm, Anne-Marie Knuth, head of Reward Advisory Nordics and Tech Sector Functional Lead EU at Aon, and Brigitte Kreiberg Peterson, Cluster HR Lead Nordics IFF, International Flavors and Fragrances, formerly DuPont. Following the presentations, we'll have a Q&A discussion with all the speakers, and we'll take audience questions. So again, please write your questions in the chat function, and we'll get to those during the discussion. So now it's my pleasure to introduce Anne-Marie Abrahamson, employment law expert and partner for Lundgren's law firm. Anne-Marie will talk about the latest legislation impacting work conditions. Anne-Marie, the floor is yours.
And thank you for that, Therese. I hope everybody can hear me. And I gave myself the challenge this morning to actually share my own presentation. So hopefully not going to start with a panic attack, but see if it's actually possible for me to share my own screen. Can you
see them?
Yeah. And is it full screen for you? Is it fine? You can read it?
Yeah.
Okay, so I'll just kick it off. But thank you, Therese, and thank you for presenting me as an employment lawyer. During the COVID and the pandemic, some of the things we've spent a lot of time advising our clients about is the possibility to create hybrid workplaces. And during this morning's sessions, I'll be taking you through some of the considerations you should make if you consider to actually implement hybrid workspaces in your company. So it's not like, how can you say, a legal textbook that we're going through. It's more like a guidance to where we would see some legal challenges and to try to make you aware how to handle those challenges. My agenda for this brief presentation is we can talk about who can decide hybrid working, how should we design the agreement on hybrid working, what about performance from home, how do we measure that, how do we measure working hours from home, what about IT security, how do we make sure code of conducts and other policies are complied with when working from home. There are some health and safety issues that needs to be taken care of if people are no longer working in the office space, and the formalities regarding the agreements concerning home working, and what happens if a person suddenly works from home abroad. That raises separate questions everybody needs to be aware of. And once the hybrid working agreement is established, how do you terminate such arrangements? So that's overall the points I'm going to touch upon. And the first point being who can decide hybrid working. Yeah, being a lawyer, one of the things we always want to start by saying is what actually do we mean by hybrid working? Everybody talks about it, but what do we mean? And I guess there is no, how can you say, a fixed definition. Hybrid working can be both working either in the company's office space and then partly from home, but remote working could also just be from anywhere. And obviously, if you allow as an employer that employees can in principle work from anywhere, that would give you several challenges in respect to those points that we are going to talk about in my presentation. The normal way to establish hybrid working would obviously be to make a mutual agreement. So the parties agree that the employee should work partly from home and partly from the office space. But the question could be raised, does the employee have a right to work partly remote? And the answer to that question is that as the starting point, no, the employee does not have such a right. But of course, if the employer establishes a general scheme where employees are given the possibility to work from home, it could be a right that deprives from the policies that the employer has implemented. But only in such case can we talk about a right to work from home. When establishing or designing a hybrid workplace model, it's important also to consider, are we talking about a voluntary model, or are we actually talking about a compulsory model where everybody is obliged to work partly from home? That also has an impact on how it is implemented. Because the last bullet here, can the employer simply just decide that from now on, some of the employees are going to work from home on a permanent basis, full-time or part-time? But such a change in the working place would be considered as a material change of terms and conditions. And that is legally regarded as a termination of the employment combined with an offer of employment on revised terms, and it cannot be implemented unless respecting the individual employee's notice of termination. So that's why we are aiming at a mutual agreement to avoid having to notify the employees of such changes. When designing the hybrid model, there is also the question, should we have one size that could fit all, or could we actually make individual setups? That is not a legal question, it's actually more a guideline question. Also, it's important to consider whether the arrangement should be temporary or permanent, and if temporary, for how long, and who can actually terminate such an arrangement. Some of you may think that how was it that the employer could actually send everybody home during the pandemic without notifying the employees regarding that? But from a legal perspective, the employer has a broader access to make temporary changes, and in particular, due to the authorities' guidelines, it was considered that it was within the managerial right to decide such temporary change of workplace. But if it's outside of the pandemic as it is right now, making a permanent change would be a material change. And then also a part of the agreement should be to consider, are we talking about a fixed setup where people work from home 1 day in the office 4 days, or is it more like a flexible setup where the employee simply just decides whether to come in or to stay at home? And it should be considered that if the business needs the employee to come into the office, it should be stated in the agreement that the company can at any time ask the employee to actually come into the office building and participate in whatever activities is needed in the office space. But also, it's important to stress that when the employee is working from home, the employee should be doing the exact same working assignments and also join whatever meetings are scheduled for the employee and be available. So it's not like an employee could just work from home and then nobody can get a hold of the employee. But these things should be described in this agreement that is set up for hybrid working. And some companies would also find the opportunity to just, as a guideline, mention that it's not working from home is not a childcare opportunity. Of course, we have the opportunity in force majeure situations where the child is ill. That's a different scenario. When working from home, it might be more difficult to measure performance. It depends, of course. We measure performance in different aspects, typically in respect of bonus schemes, but it might also be in connection with salary reviews. And depending on the criteria that we measure, if it's hard criteria numbers, such as a size of a sale or numbers of hours, then it's not that difficult, or it's exactly the same to measure performance from home. But if we're talking about more soft criteria, such as flexibility, service-minded, team spirit, and whatever, it might be necessary to revisit the KPIs to be used for an employee working partly from home, and to make sure that it still makes sense to actually measure on these things, or if so, how is it done when working from home? Another relevant aspect is the working hours. There are certain legal requirements for the employer to make sure that the employee does not work in violation of the working time regulation. It is particularly the 48 hours rule that comes into play here. An employer must make sure that an employee does not work more than 48 hours per week as an average, calculated over a period of 4 months. And therefore, it's necessary that the employer has some kind of way to control that when the employee works from home, it doesn't just get one long work day, which might become a violation of the working time directive. It could be possible to enter a clause in the hybrid working agreement where it says the maximum working hours are 48 hours according to the working time directive, and it's the employee's responsibility to make sure that this is not excessed, and to notify the employer if that should be the case. But also for those employees who are entitled to overtime compensation, it's important to make sure that it is stipulated when are we talking about overtime. There should be some kind of manager approval before overtime when working from home should be accepted. Yeah, this is of course quite important that most companies today have very strict IT security regulation, and it's important to make sure that these guidelines are also complied with when working from home. And if we're talking about the general hybrid model, for example, a person can work from anywhere. The person could actually also work from a cafe. And if that is possible, how do we make sure that we can maintain the high level of IT security that we need? Questions like those should be handled in the agreements to be drafted in this connection, but also the use of paper documentation and have that lying around in a home office. Is that allowed? How do you handle that? And for some companies, even allowing windows, or not your you have to have windows in your office because of the lighting, but to make sure that you are aware that it might create unintentional exposure of confidential information, and have that guideline also. Yes, this is more like, how can you say, general maintenance or guideline to make sure that if you want to have an impact on how people dress when they're working from home and they access virtual meetings, you can set a code for that, being reasonable, that if you want to have an influence on that. Some companies would say, no, we like it the way it is. So we think it's also part of the how can you say, multiple employee experience that people are working from home. Somebody didn't get time to take a bath in the morning, and that's just part of, the expression that we give. Other companies, for example, like the one I'm working with, would prefer that people actually take a shower and also shave before attending virtual meetings from home. And the shaving was not for myself, at least, but for male employees. Anyways, but that's just, I think, also some depending on which company you work in. Some of the more hardcore legal requirements relates to the health and safety. When the employee work from home, it is still, and it's more than 1 day per week. then it's the employer's responsibility to make sure that the employee is working in a healthy and safety working environment. And there are some requirements in terms of how the home office should be established in terms of lighting, chair, table, and so on. And one very relevant question is, who pays for the establishment of the home office? Does the employer have the duty to pay for the work office? And what we can see in the guidelines from the authorities is that it's the employer's responsibility to comply with the regulation, the health and safety regulation, but it doesn't say anywhere in here that it's the employer's duty to pay for furniture or a table that can be leveraged and so on. So it depends on the agreement with the employee. So it could be in a fully flexible model that the employee would have to, pay for that equipment by himself without having any refund of those expenses. But regardless of which model, whether the employer pays a home office allowance, it's the employer's responsibility when the employee is working more than 1 day per week from home. And the employee must also be covered by the mandatory occupational injury insurance. And when doing a workplace assessment, the home office must also be included. Please bear in mind that the employer does not have an access to kind of visit the home office. So that's not possible. It's not possible to come on an inspection. So therefore, the cooperation between the employer and the employee is important. Here I just scheduled or included a checklist, which I think could be very useful to make sure that the employee actually goes through this. It's just an example. It's not an improved checklist, but just to, as an employer, to provide the employees with such a checklist to make sure that they click the box in terms of the lighting, the chair, the temperature, and so on in the workplace. When making an arrangement regarding the change of workplace, that is a material term of employment, and according to the Employment Contract Act, this must be included in the employment agreement that now the working place is partly in the office space and partly at home. It can be done by an appendix. It can also be done by a reference to the employee handbook if there is a general description of this in the employee handbook. Please bear in mind that making these changes and implementing these home working setups as a general possibility for all employees should go through the committee, if such exists, a cooperation committee. And according to collective agreement and also the act on the duty to inform and consult with the employees in companies with more than 35 employees, these obligations should be complied with. And I know I'm running out of time, so I'll just briefly touch upon very, very important questions regarding working abroad, because the employer has to some extent to be able to control that the employee doesn't all of a sudden move beyond borders abroad, because that could affect the choice of mandatory employment law, which is as a starting point determined by the place of work of the employee, but also the taxation of the individual employee, but also the corporate taxation of the company regarding permanent establishment in another jurisdiction may come into play. The question regarding Social Security, where is the employee subject to Social Security, it's extremely important because the contributions in different jurisdictions vary so much. And therefore, it's a good idea to have a clear guideline in the agreement saying that the employee is not entitled to move abroad, must work in this jurisdiction. And if the employee do it anyway, then the employee must indemnify the employer of any additional costs which is a result of such violation of the policy. And then as my final slides, once this agreement and the program has been established, how do you terminate it? And just the way that you actually did establish it, if the employer wants to do it by enforcing a termination, this will be regarded as a material change and it's subject to notification by the individual notice of termination and cannot be enforced prior to the expiry of the notice period. If a general change is made, always bear in mind that general changes, if you then meet the thresholds of the mass redundancy procedures, you have to follow the mass redundancy procedures. I can add a few details on that later on if you want me to elaborate on that. But given my time here, I will just leave it at that. And back to you, Therese.
Thanks, Anne-Marie. That's excellent. We will move on and take more questions during the Q&A. However, there is one here that I thought was very relevant from Annette Bjork at Hess. When the employer does not have access to a private home, how is a workplace assessment conducted?
Yeah, that was also part of, you should create kind of an interview scheme, which you would then interview the employee around. And of course, as an employer, you would have to rely on the information that the employee gives you by doing that. So it's not possible for the employer to inspect the home office. You could use something around like the checklist I showed you, but then just as a scheme for the APV or the work access assessment. Yeah, workplace assessment.
Okay, great. Thanks. And we do have one more quick question before we move on. And that is, would guidelines posted on the intranet from home rules be sufficient?
It depends on how that is done in the company, because if in the employment agreement there is a reference that any policies applicable in the company will be shown at the intranet, then it could be that it is a compliance implementation into the employment agreement. So it depends. You have to make sure that there is somewhere in the employment agreement or in an appendix to the employment agreement and a reference to where are the policies.
Okay, great. All right. I think we'll have to leave it at that. We'll take the next question from Mass. We'll take that during the Q&A. So now I would like to introduce Anne-Marie Knuth, who is Head of Reward Advisory Nordics and EU Tech Industry Lead at Aon. Anne-Marie will present the 7th COVID-19 Pulse Survey of 1,451 HR professionals on plans to redesign their workforce strategies. Anne-Marie?
Thank you, Therese, and good morning, everyone. I'm really delighted to be here today, and with my part of the session, I hope to give you some inspiration on how to manage the changes to ways of working that comes as a consequence of the pandemic. And I would do so by sharing insights to what measures other companies are taking as a reaction to COVID-19. I can't see a presentation.
Would you, Sophie, could you share Anne-Marie's slides, please? There we go.
Great. So if you just jump to the next slide, first of all, an introduction of myself and where I come from. As Therese mentioned, I work at Aon. I've been at Aon for 2 years, and I head up our Nordics Rewards Advisory practice. And I'm also the European lead for tech industry. I'm basically advising senior management, HR, and boards on performance and rewards matters. And I'm primarily working with global tech and life science clients. I have a background of working in this field for 17 years, so really specialized within performance and rewards, heading up these functions in companies such as NKT, SimCorp, and Statoil. And if you move to the next slide, as I mentioned, I work at Aon, and Aon is a global risk management advisor. Could you move to the next slide?
Can you see the slide, Anne-Marie?
Yeah, I still see the presentation, but never mind my presentation. So Aon is a global risk management advisor and insurance and retirement broker, but we also have a human capital solutions business line, and that's the one I belong to. At Human Capital Solution, we advise clients on all talent-related matters, but have a special focus on helping our clients on the future work journey, on assessment and competency development, and on all aspects of rewards and performance management. So if you move to the next slide, the input to this session is, as Therese mentioned, our COVID pulse surveys, and we have run those in Aon over the last year, covering various people-related topics on how companies are responding and reacting to the pandemic. We just ran our 7th survey here in April, and the results are fresh off the press, and that's what I want to share with you here today. So through this year, we've seen a clear development throughout the pandemic, from companies focusing very much on crisis management and managing short-term issues to now having more focus on business continuity and long-term structural changes in employee policies and offerings, and managing the changes of how, where, and when employees work. So the 7th survey had around 1,500 participating companies from North America and Europe. And the topics that we covered was, for example, how are companies returning employees to the workplace? How will companies work determine future location strategy and remote working? How are companies using location-based pay strategies, or how are they changing them? And by this, I mean, so previously, pay has really much been differentiated according to the office location, but companies are looking into whether home location should also be kind of a differentiator. We're looking into future work strategies, and finally, we're also covering diversity, equity, and inclusion strategies. So in this session, I will not cover all the topics above, but focus on the areas we know right now is a very important point on many companies' agenda. And that's basically the changed working patterns and structures of our workforce and how to manage that. The survey in itself provides much more insight than I will share today, and it's actually a survey that we provide for free, so feel free to reach out to me directly in case you would like access to the full results. So if you move on to the next slide, I just want to share some key highlights before zooming in on some of these specific areas. So what we can see is that most organizations are now at a stage where they have a plan and a tentative date for when and how to return their employees on site. But obviously the vast majority of participants also either have or are planning to update their remote work policy, basically because the patterns, needs, employee requests and use of technology has changed dramatically. 39% of the participants have already or are considering how they work with geographical differentials on pay. So do they change their approach to this? So where most companies have previously set pay levels based on the office location, as I mentioned before, many companies are looking into what the consequences should be for pay strategy, pay levels, and benefits for employees working remotely or employees changing location. So I just want to say that this is, of course, a bigger topic in larger countries where pay differs quite a lot between geographies. So that could, for example, be US, UK, and Germany. So just as an example, in UK, we see that pay levels for similar roles can vary 30 to 40% depending on location. So it is really important to decide what location changes means for your pay levels and consequently also your talent sourcing strategy. But I will come with a bit more on that later on. We have also asked the participants about vaccine support and how they encourage employees to get vaccinated. And here we actually see that 41% of companies are either considering providing or will provide incentives to employees to get a vaccine. And that can be many things. For example, time off to get the vaccine, payment for vaccine where in countries where that's not provided by government, or it can actually be an actual bonus. And I think this is again more prevalent in other countries in Denmark, where the attitude towards vaccination is different than it is here. Finally, we can also see from the survey that the pandemic has speeded up companies' focus on their future of work, because most companies now have a clear definition of their future of work or are working on it now. And that's a big difference from a year ago, where most companies were quite vague on this, to be honest. Final thing is diversity, equity, and inclusion continues to be a key area of focus. This is, of course, not related to COVID-19, but we see organizations that are really reshaping for the future and creating agile workforce strategies have this as a key topic. So if you move to the next slide, I think if we can say that anything good comes out of this pandemic, it might be that we've really seen it being a catalyst for changing how we work and creating this focus on future-proofing the organization. In the first pulse survey we ran over a year ago, the vast majority of companies was in a phase of reacting and responding to the pandemic, which meant that they were really focusing on short-term crisis management. This is no longer the focus for most organizations. Their focus is now on how to recover from the pandemic and how to ensure business continuity. We do also see more and more companies. So in this latest survey, 26% using the pandemic as a foundation to reshape the organization, future-proofing the organization, and perhaps even using the circumstances to create a platform for agility, change, differentiation, and growth. We also see many organizations now have put in place a future of work task force. Still, we're not at the stage where everybody has a clear definition of the future of work, but many of the organizations actually claim that they're aiming to have that definition in place within the next 90 days. And I think in this forum, it's also important to note that HR is generally considered one of the top drivers of the future of work strategy for their firms, together with the corporate strategy groups and top executive management. So if you move to the next slide, I would like to zoom in on the 26% of the organizations that I mentioned that are now in the phase of reshaping for the future, because I think it's really interesting to look at their focus, because we can see that those that are already reshaping for the future are doing things very differently from other organizations. So the ones that are still in the more recovery phase, focusing on returning to workplace and so on. So what we can see that these future-ready organizations are doing is that they are implementing flexible, remote, and on-site working arrangement based on a clear understanding of what work looks like for them in this new, better world by taking business, talent, cultural, and strategic needs into considerations. They're also undertaking and communicating their diversity, equity, and inclusion to both internal and external stakeholders, and really taking meaningful action to build upon their existing efforts in this area. They also have a tendency to look at everything holistically as they optimize their workforces from the perspectives of both cost, future skill need, and mobility and development initiatives. And finally, what we also can see is that they're really enabling their employees with differentiated well-being programs that works for everyone, tailored to the employees' needs, with the aim of basically building a resilient workforce. So on the next slide, so I think while it's really interesting to look at what the reshaping organizations are doing, I think reality is that most of us are still in the recovery phase with focus on returning to office, whatever that means for the individual organization, because it for sure does not look like it did 1.5 years ago. But basically, most organizations from our survey have an aspiration to return to the office, but many employees will in the future remain remote, either fully or partly, and there are many different approaches to this. So in the graph on the slide, you can see that our survey shows that 74%, or 3 out of 4 organizations, are looking to return half or more of their workers to the workplace at some point. What that return will look like is still up in the air to some extent, with many different approaches in play. It does, though, look like a 2 to 3 day return to the office seems like the most dominant approach. I think what this ideally looks like in your organization really depends on your context, but I recommend you to determine it by asking yourselves questions such as, what are your criteria to determine who can work remotely or hybrid on a more permanent basis? You also need to understand both employees and managers' readiness to work or lead effectively in a flexible and virtual environment. And if there are any gaps, then you need to build these capabilities. Also, you need to understand what is the impact on the ways of working that you choose, and how does that impact the organization as a whole, the culture, and so on. Does this actually give you a competitive advantage or maybe a disadvantage? You should also consider whether you can balance optimizing your cost base with accessing diverse skill and capabilities through having a clear location and sourcing strategy, and also understand how can you build a more inclusive workplace and at the same time drive workforce diversity and resilience. So on the next slide, just to state once more that ways of work are changes. Our latest survey shows that 1/3 of organizations have already made an assessment of which roles that in the future can work remote, and 1/3 is planning to do so. And you can also see here that almost all organizations have already or are in the process of redesigning their remote working policy. And if you move to the next slide, you can see the topics covered in the remote working policy for most organizations are, so which employees are eligible, what is the typical approval process, how do you handle technology, how do you handle remote working frequency, but also topics such as traveling for meetings, what's the policy for that going forward, how and when remote workers should be available. So is that a specific hours? Is there some other parameters? How do you handle expenses, and how does this impact the employees' compensation? Are some of the topics that are typically covered in the policies. On the next slide, we also asked the companies what their view is on relocation of employees that have a desire to work more remotely. And the most typical approach is to allow employees to choose a new work location within their current country. So that would typically be the home office solution. There does not seem to be a big appetite at this stage to allow employees to basically choose to work from anywhere in the world, so new work location outside of their current country. And I think linking back to Anne-Marie's presentation previously, I mean, that also has some practical consequences on tax, social security, and so on that needs to be covered. Also, there doesn't seem to be big changes in how companies view general relocation and expatriation compared to pre-COVID. If you choose the next slide, we also looked at what working models the participants provide for the employee groups that qualify to work remotely. So do they add more contractors or part-time workers? Do they offer an office work only or remote work only? Or is it this hybrid we've named a couple of times throughout this morning? And really the most prevalent solution seems to be a hybrid working model, the combination of both remote and office working. But there's actually also a substantial number of organizations that will provide or aim to provide either office only or remote working only solutions. So moving one slide ahead, one of the topics that is actually high on many's agenda is how should changes in where employees work impact pay and benefits. As you can see, 1/3 already applied geographical differentials prior to COVID for remote employees, and another 1/4 have implemented during the pandemic or is working on it now. And I think I appreciate that this is not necessarily a big topic in a small country like Denmark, where we don't necessarily see huge differences in pay depending on where in Denmark you're located. But I still believe it's something that you must actively take a decision on. And that's maybe not differentiating on pay based on location, but at least looking at your total employee value proposition and the employee experience and what you offer. Because as work patterns change, so will employee needs. For example, for remote workers, the need for a home office and other types of well-being initiatives might be needed. For the companies that do provide these geo differentials, the most common approach is to base the adjustments on either home location. So what is the typical pay level where the home is located, where the nearest office location is, or simply decide on a case-by-case basis. On the next slide, you can see, so as I just spoke to, I think it's important to review your employee value proposition as work patterns are changing. So here's just a quick oversight of what other companies are actively reviewing as a consequence of changed demands from needs, for example. The impact on company culture can be quite substantial. So not surprisingly, culture is a key priority. Maintaining a healthy work-life balance is also maybe more now than ever. Career development is also a key focus. And I think one thing to really bear in mind is that a number of employees will maybe not be that visible all of a sudden because they're not physically present in the organization. So how do you make sure that you still have effective career development in that light? Also, employee experience for both remote and on-site employees is a high priority, and also in general, the consequences for compensation and benefits. So next slide, my last slide. So I hope I've given a bit of insight to what your peers are doing. But I think what is really important to note and reflect on is that there's no one model fits all. It really differs based on your strategy, your context, culture, and business model. So I think it's just really important that you define the model that's right for you. And I also realize that you all may be on quite different places or stages of your journey in creating this new better. But I just wanted to share how we at AmCham recommend a 3-step process to defining your future way of working model. So first of all, it really starts with defining your new better by building the foundation. And that could, for example, be determining your degree of remote versus office work and your location strategy. Then it's about engaging your employees by ensuring you have the right capabilities, by, for example, ensuring that virtual capabilities of employees and leaders, but also making sure that you have the right technology in place, and then having the right people processes, right employee offerings, and the right workplace policies. And then finally, when you have that in place, it's really about reshaping and rethinking the way you work and what implication it has on your culture, your work environment. And this is where you can really build an agile and future fit workforce. So that concludes my session. I hope it gave you some inspiration on the path you can take on this journey. So Therese, the word back to you.
Thank you very much, Anne-Marie. Before we move on to Brigitte, I did have one question, and that is, do you think the increase of remote working is going to cause companies to actually look outside or further away for source talent outside of their own areas?
Yeah, I think it's a really, really good question. And I do think in the long term, I think yes. I think COVID has been an eye-opener for many that, talent does not necessarily need to be placed in an hour's driving distance from the head office. So I really think that there is an opportunity for HRs to kind of develop a broader sourcing strategy. But I also think that there is some, you can say, practical work to be done on having good supporting systems for truly remote working, such as ensuring effective collaboration, team building, how do you handle career development, and make sure that you have managers that can actually facilitate all of this.
Great. Okay. Well, thanks so much. And we'll take more questions during the Q&A. Now I'd like to introduce Birgitte Kreiberg-Petersen, who's the Cluster HR Leader in the Nordics for IFF, International Flavors and Fragrances. Birgitte joined DuPont in 2018. Prior to that, she spent 8 years with Novo Nordisk and 18 years with Shell. With comprehensive experience in change management and organizational design, Birgitte manages a team of 7 HR managers in 14 locations with approximately 1,700 employees across the Nordics. Today, she will talk about the kinds of considerations that a global organization needs to keep in mind when undergoing such immense change. Birgitte, welcome.
Thank you, Therese, and thank you for allowing me to speak today. Can you please share my slide? So what I will share today, and the purpose of my presentation, is to share an example of a global company that has implemented a hybrid work model. We are definitely not in the final phases that Anne-Marie just spoke to. We are still in the reshaping phases, and I will share some of the lessons learned or some of the insights that I have gained from that. Next slide, please. So IFF is a recent merger of DuPont Nutrition Biosciences business and International Flavors and Fragrances. The deal was made in December 2019, so we have been doing one of the world's largest deal on value or merger on value during the lockdown period, and we have not been able to meet up at all during that project. So we think that's a milestone recognizing virtual working in itself. IFF has 4 divisions, and we are represented in multiple countries across the globe. So we are operating globally in a matrix organization. Next slide, please. So our values and cultural principles speak very well to hybrid working already. We have key cultural principles of act like an owner, be agile, and collaborating and winning together. So we have been used to working across distance and time for quite a while, and that's why we think there is an opportunity for us to leverage a hybrid work model. Can you share next slide, please? So the drivers organizations are typically considering is talent. Do we need to offer a hybrid work option to stay competitive in the talent market? As Anne-Marie was just talking to, does this give us access to new talent pools in new geographies? We have a leadership and culture already that is capable of working in a matrix organization across borders. Can we leverage this? We have some manager and employee capabilities to take shared ownership and work in this way. We also see that employees have voiced that during the pandemic, they found that they could save time when commuting. It could improve their work-life fit. We also had the increased flexibility notions that it drives engagement, this ability to choose where do I want to work from today, what fits my schedule. And in some working situations, home working can be more effective. So these are all drivers that suit that. Least but not is also the reducing our footprint. This is both from an environmental perspective, but certainly also for a cost perspective, because if people start home working, finance is the first to put their finger up, then do we then really need a desk for all, or is our desk utilization rate so that we can actually reduce a number of the desks in the office? So these are some of the drivers that we have considered. Can you share next slide, please? So the hybrid model at IFF, it's very important to say this has our executive committee sponsorship. Each site has an executive committee member as a sponsor driving the project implementation. It's a global project that provides a framework and tools for local to use. In order to drive alignment and ensure some consistency, we operate with 3 layers. So we have a global layer, a regional layer, and a country layer. This is needed in order to escalate if we have issues, learnings, or adjustment needed, and it takes away some of the complexity by having these 3 layers. The ambition is not that this is a one-size-fits-all. We have in the Nordics, where I am responsible, quite a lot of production sites, and in production you need to be on site. We have R&D sites where perhaps being on site has values in terms of intellectual capital generation. And we have sales where people typically are not that often on site at all. So one size doesn't fit all. The flexibility needs to be considered. So that's why we said it's driven by the country HR, functions and business. They chip in and we jointly agree what is the model for our site or for our country. So country HR's role in this is to ensure that we comply with local labor laws. As Anne-Marie's presentation first showed, there are quite some distinct legislative requirements in each country. It's also important that we ensure that the obligations towards councils and unions are considered. We've defined measures of success. We've also set up a reporting methodology, and we are monitoring progress towards implementing this. At IFF, this talks to being more agile and it talks to providing a better employee engagement. So these are the ambitions we want to achieve. The hybrid work profiles that we have introduced are 4, and they basically range from being on-site to being completely off-site, and 2 models in between with a variation of being partly mostly on-site and partly mostly at home. So this provides a common framework that people can use to reference what do they want to have and what work model would suit their kind of role. Next slide, please. So the key considerations when we have been implementing is, first of all, to look at the individual's roles and responsibilities. Is this kind of hybrid work model at all possible for this individual? Then we have had to recognize there's a reconnection period after COVID-19. A lot of people, some sites, are still working from home because they're simply not able to return to an office. We also look at employee preferences because some individuals thrive with home working. Others individuals thrive in an office close to colleagues where they can have co-creation and inspiration on a daily basis. The infrastructure challenges also need to be considered. We have people that live in areas where infrastructure, or you can say virtual working, is not possible because there's no internet connectivity to support that. We also have different home situations, different family situations that needs to be considered. So these are the things that we go through and check and consider when we are implementing it. Next slide, please. So the culture of the hybrid work model that we have defined and we are working with is, first of all, from a talent and expertise point of view, we believe this is a must-have in order to remain attractive for the future workforce. On leadership, we think work is what you do, and we think we can leverage on our leadership capabilities. On collaboration, we realize that one person may have an impact on a team. So it's not just what fits the individual, it's also how the team become productive that needs to be considered. On empowerment, we hold ourselves and employees accountable for working in this way. This is part of our core culture, act like an owner. On integrity, this is built on trust, and we must ensure that this is a fair arrangement for both employer and employee. On innovation, we need to be more effective, and this also talks to supporting our digital transformation. On quality, we evaluate and we measure our progress of future work or hybrid model. And to finalize this, we recognize that this is just the beginning. We are learning as we go along. This is not set in stone, and we need to make many adjustments as we progress forward. Next slide, please. So the lesson learned from a country perspective, certainly the country COVID-19 stages, they must be considered because we launched this in April, May, and it's really evident that one global timeline is simply not possible. When you can't have one global timeline, the challenge if you have a global matrix organization is that some managers with teams in multiple countries might want to move ahead, but then not all the countries where they have employees are ready yet. So there are some considerations on how you want to move forward to allow managers to do this in a way that's effective for them. And we have certainly seen that we might convince around an implementation timeline in September that would allow managers some sort of consistent approach for their teams. But this has been a challenge for us to consider. The labor laws, they vary a lot. So we need to formalize terms and conditions for hybrid work arrangements. But the whole global program only gives a very high level, which of the 4 hybrid work models do you want to have and which days do you want to work from home. All the things that Anne-Marie shared in her first presentation on the legislation needs to be considered either as part of the employee handbook or as part of a formal agreement that the employee needs to sign. And this is where it gets a little bit complex when you have a global organization with managers with employees in many countries, because how do you convey these terms and conditions to them in a way that they fully understand the implications of this? Because it's not just the nature of the task and job that needs to be considered. It's also the team that they're working with. It's also the terms that apply. Just a simple thing, and if you want to save office space, obviously you cannot have a designated workspace if you're working predominantly from home. These terms need to be shared with the employee before they make a decision. They also need to be shared with the manager because they may have implications on how this team can be collaborating and working together effectively. So how do you make sure that an informed decision is taken both from the side of the manager, but also from the side of the employee? The company benefits implementing the hybrid work model varies across facilities. So is this something that is driven by saving cost and we want to offer some sort of incentivize to move home? Or is this driven by a voluntary opportunity to work from home to secure talent? These considerations need to be taken at a local level because this is going to be individual and depending on the site. So these were some of my lessons learned from a country HR perspective, implementing a global framework. So thank you for your time.
Thank you, Birgitte. That was a really great presentation. So I think now we're going to go ahead and begin the chat, the Q&A. So please add your questions in the chat function. And I'd like to start with one of those. And so Birgitte, you just mentioned that companies need to take into consideration whether this is a cost cutting or is it employee attraction and employee satisfaction. Anne-Marie Knuth, in your study, do you have any indication of what are the reasons that these companies, for the most part, are making these changes? Is it actual cost cutting? And of course, different parts of the organization have different ideas of what would be good. So any ideas on that?
Yes, I think what we can see is that it actually differs based on who in the organization that answers the questionnaire. Mm-hmm. So I think there is different, views or takes, whether you are in finance, whether you're in HR, whether you're in the top management. So I think key is, to have that balanced discussion. So obviously cost should also be a part of it, but key is really to how do you kind of unlock the potential of these new opportunities and have this, create good opportunities both for the employees to maybe have more flexibility, but still also make sure that you have a strengthened culture, collaboration of all of that. So I think that's what we see. Okay,
great, thank you. So I have a question in the chat from Linda at Roche, I believe. How do you work with your culture when more colleagues work from home? Anybody can respond to that?
I can give it a go because we just launched, because we merged on the 1st of February, we also launched a big cultural program because we need to merge the culture of 2 equal-sized organizations of 12,000 employees each. So we are working this as a cultural ambassador program. So it's anchored by a person on each site, driving sessions to talk about what does it mean to be an owner, what does it mean to be agile. But this is going to be partly virtual and partly face-to-face. So each session has been designed so that it's one of each. And I don't know how it will come out. I don't know if we're going to be as productive when we do this virtually, but time will show. But I think it's a very good question because that's certainly also on my mind.
Yeah, absolutely. I think a lot of companies are struggling with that right now from a lot of people that I've been speaking with. So I have another question for Birgitte. So what advice would you give with lessons learned regarding managers who have a team spread out around the world? Should we wait to implement until the countries are more aligned?
Yes, I think the managers would get much more, you can say, impact if they do this when all the countries are ready and they can discuss with their team. I think, Anne-Marie, you were talking about you can define a code of conduct in terms of dress code. I think it's also good for teams to find sort of like a code of conduct on how they want to collaborate and work together. So if you do it collectively, you can have these kind of conversations in a better way. If you do it individually, you might lose that opportunity. So that would certainly be my recommendation.
Just Anne-Marie Knudsen, do you have anything to add to that?
No, I fully agree to that.
Okay, great. Before we go too far, now I'm going to switch gears just a little bit, and I want to get back to Mads Gullhammer's question to Anne-Marie Abrahamson on the appendix agreement to work from home. Is that also going to be notified as a termination of the employment contract with a new offer, since there are often more than 5 kilometers from the original workplace?
As I mentioned during my presentation, it depends whether it is a mutual agreement or it is something that the employer decides unilaterally. So I think to answer your question, you always have to consider, do the parties agree? Then you don't have to notify. Then you can just make this appendix. And to the question whether it needs to be signed, I guess that was also part of my own presentation. We have no requirement in Danish law to have a signature on an appendix, and actually also not on an employment agreement. The only reason we have it is to make sure that we can prove as an employer that the employee has accepted the terms in relation to the home working appendix or the employment agreement itself. But the duty that lies on the employer to inform the employees on all material terms of employment can actually be done simply by sending information about the terms. But that was just a footnote to the question. So to answer whether it needs to be notified, if it's something that the company decides alone, this is compulsory, we will now change the workplace, then it is something that needs to be notified. But you always have to consider individually whether it's a material change. But the fact that you move the employee to have worked 5 days in the office space to now work 4 days in the office space and 1 day at home, even though the home is right next to the office space, it would need a notification, because you are now asking employees to actually sit in their own home to work, which would be a material change if the employees do not accept.
Great, Massa, I hope that answers your question. So back to as a more big picture question. These changes could be very dramatic for leaders who are used to leading in a more traditional way. How do leaders like that manage to find the ability to trust employees when they can't see them and be with them? What are the sort of ways that that they get included in this? And do you guys have any thoughts on that?
Yeah, so I think my perspective is communication is always key, continuous alignment, making sure that you and the manager and the employee have, a good system to make sure that they speak the same language, that whatever is required is, understood for both the employee and the manager, and maybe even more so than you would do in an actual work environment, right? That you encourage leaders to continuously follow up, be there a lot to make sure that they're aligned at all times, both in terms of what are the expectations, how is it going, and so on. So really, taking the performance management and the discussion that have been the last couple of years around ongoing dialogue rather than a rating at the end of the year, really emphasizing that's super important, I think.
Yes, Brigitte, any thoughts about that?
Yeah, I think you're absolutely right, Anne-Marie. It exposes your performance management capabilities big time. But I think one of the things managers need to be aware of is that if we are doing Teams and virtual meetings, we tend to be very focused on the formal communication. We need to get the informal communication going as well. These are the sort of little points about what's happening in your social life outside work, what is actually going on in your office. So we're not just focused on the task, but focused on the individual and the team as such.
Yeah, and maybe I can just add to that, because I think that's a super important point. And that's this whole thing about people being very different in a virtual setting, right? So some are, very extrovert and very immediate, some are not. So that also requires some capabilities from the meeting facilitator or the leader to make sure that everybody becomes a little bit more on equal terms.
Right, exactly. I have a question from Linda on that as well. If she says, if I can be a bit provocative, in an agile organization with self-leading teams, I would presume that we trust our colleagues and do not check.
I think that's a very good question, because yes, we have a very high level of trust in the Nordics, but I don't think it's the same level of trust across the world. And we are a global company rolling this out. So we are very aware that trust is something we need to work on, and we need to build these manager capabilities, because as Anne-Marie was talking to, we think we may have a gap in that area in certain regions.
Yes, I can absolutely imagine that you do. So back to the idea of employee engagement, and also trying to engage those employees who you may not see very often. How are those being measured, and are there ways that you can actually measure employee engagement in a remote environment? Anybody?
Well, I'm the one sitting in a company. I can say we do pulse surveys. So we don't do sort of like a one annual survey, because we understand post-merger as well that we need to have more than an annual measurement. So we've been doing pulse surveys to see how people are feeling. But I am pretty sure you could be feeling awful. You could be sitting alone. Your manager could not reach out to you for days or weeks even, and nobody would notice almost. So it is really, really important that managers take this responsibility to check in with their team members.
And if I can just add there, because I was trying to make a comment also on the psychological working environment, because the employer has not only to make sure that the employee has a health and safety workplace at home, but also to make sure that the psychological working environment is in compliance with the health and safety requirements. And one of the things we talk about a lot is whether we are going to see many, how can you say, work-related psychological problems following from people working from home, anxiety-related questions and so on, people who are actually now nervous to come back into the office and perhaps prefer to stay at home. So I think we haven't seen those cases yet, but we would assume that there will be some, because it's been also pretty broadly covered in the press that is what is experienced, that not only are people drinking more alcohol when working from home, because that's actually also proven, but they also some suffer these psychological challenges. So it was actually more a comment on my side.
Yes, no, absolutely. So does anybody have any additional thoughts to add or questions to add to the chat? I've gone through my questions for today. Any other thoughts? No? Okay, well, I think we'll wrap up the program then. Thank you to our speakers, Anne-Marie Knuth and Anne-Marie Abrahamson and Birgitte Kreiber-Pedersen, for sharing their insight and time with us this morning. And thanks to everybody for joining. I hope to see you all in person after the summer, where we're going to start holding some more face-to-face events. So with that, have a wonderful day and a wonderful weekend, and I look forward to seeing you soon. Thank you.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you. Well, that worked out great. Yeah, you guys still on? Okay.
Yes, we're still on.
Yeah. Okay. Good. Yes. So that was. I thought that went well, and I think that timing-wise, it was actually good. I was concerned we were going to go a little bit over, but you guys are amazing at. at keeping your presentations concise.
It was very